Hi everyone, and welcome to this evening's session in regards to pool and spa safety barriers and the new regulations. My name is Ian Watson. I conducted the session one last week, and I'm joined this week by Ben Griffiths. Welcome, Ben, and thanks for joining us.
No, thank you, Ian. Yeah, good to be part of it.
Could you just give everyone a bit of a background on your work history, Ben, if you don't mind?
Yeah, no worries.
This boat lives near.
Yeah, I'm a building surveyor. I work for the Horsham Rural City Council and also Hindmarsh and West Wimmera Shire councils. In my background, I've been a building surveyor now for about 4 years. Prior to that, I've been a registered building inspector for around 9 years now, and yeah, just been involved in lots of different projects in the Wimmera areas, and yeah, it's been good journey so far. So
fantastic, thanks for that. So tonight is a Q&A session. And Ben and I are going to answer some questions that have been submitted prior on Facebook and various other mediums.
Actually, will probably go flat.
And so I'm going to kick off proceedings. We might just take it one each, if that's all right with you, Ben.
yeah, no
so one of the questions we received was, I live in an apartment complex with a shared community pool. And the person was just wanting to know who's responsible for registering the pool.
He is.
So when a pool or a spa is on common property managed by an owners corporation, the owners corp is responsible for the registration, inspection and certification of the pool or spa barrier. I guess following the same process as if a person who owned a dwelling had a pool, it's the same process, but the responsible person or entity is the owners corp. Ben, here's one for you. If someone is constructing a side fence, does this require a building permit?
Yes, it does. And only if it exceeds 2 metres in height. There is an exemption in the building regulations for side fences, as long as they don't exceed 2 metres in height, then they are exempt from a building permit. So,
yeah, and it's a big one in council, isn't it? It's a big one in council because it's at council level, because it's the point of much contention amongst neighbours as to fence heights and new fences and who pays for them and that sort of thing.
That's right. Yeah, all those types of things. Yeah, who's going to construct them, like you said, and who's going to pay. And you know, some of these issues are civil matters between the owner, between the two owners. But there's also a requirement, in addition to, if the fence height exceeds 2 metres in height, like I said before, it would require a building permit. But there's also citing under the building regulations where report and consent is also required for a fence higher than 2 metres. So you've got to, it's a separate application, and there's also consent required as part of that process from the neighbour on the side that it's in question, and these sorts of things. But yeah, hopefully that answers that question as well as possible. So
thanks for that, Ben. If I could just ask if anyone's not on mute, if they could just mute themselves. I'm getting a bit of feedback somewhere along the line, along with my son, who I can hear bouncing a basketball right out the front of the window where I'm doing this. So yeah, if you could just pop yourself on mute if you're not so already. I'll take the next one. And again, it relates to pools and spas. It says, I'm renting a property which has a pool or spa. As a tenant, do I have to register or notify the council? And the answer is no. The owner's responsible, a bit like the owner's core, the owner's responsible for registering the pool or spa with council and for arranging the inspections and the certification of the barriers. The note here goes on to say, however, as an occupier, you may inspect council's register for information relating to the pool or spa on the property you're renting, including whether the pool or spa is registered and whether the barrier has a current compliance certificate. So I'd imagine some people will find that quite useful, you know, if they are looking at a rental property and it does have a swimming pool, just to check whether the registration process is up to scratch or not. The next one's for you, Ben. Then I'm going to place myself on, take the screen off for a moment and just ask my son to stop bouncing that basketball. Can someone build a shed on the boundary of their property? And are there any specific requirements relating to the size for compliance in this location? So I'll leave this one with you, Ben, and then I'll be back in a moment if you just excuse me.
Yep. No, thanks, Ian. Yeah, look, yes, you can build a shed on a boundary. There's some requirements that people need to be aware of when building sheds on boundaries. One is that under the citing of the building regulations, these sheds can't exceed, or they shouldn't, to be in line with the building regulations, they shouldn't exceed 3.2 metres in average wall height, and they also have a maximum wall length that they need to be within the building regulations to comply. Now, if they don't meet these requirements, they then, as I mentioned before, there's a separate process in addition to the building permit, which is applying for what we call report and consent, which means that the height or the length of the shed may be outside the regulations, and consent needs to be applied for, and consent from the neighbour on the affected side needs to be given as part of that process as well. So,
but I think they're trying to say, can they build the shed as the boundary pool fence?
Could we just, again, if I could just ask if everyone could put themselves on mute. As I mentioned before, we are getting a bit of feedback and can hear a few people chatting away, so that'd be much appreciated if you could. Thank you.
So yeah, and there's just the boundary is classed as the wall being basically 0 to 200 mils off the boundary line, and that's just basically it could be a couple of scenarios. It could be where the sidewall's on the boundary and you've got a gutter that is on that side, and generally you'll set the shed back at 200 mils just to allow for that gutter to not project into the neighbouring property and things like that. Otherwise, yeah, if it was the shed was swung around and the gable end was on the boundary, then you could go right to the boundary line.
Yeah, and I think that the 200 mil was changed, wasn't it, Ben? It was initially 150 mil, but that was just a bit tight to allow for the gutter and fascia and whatnot. So they've generously given another 50 mil to squeeze it all in.
Make it all work. Yeah, that's right.
Yep. Okay. Thanks for that, mate.
No worries.
The next one, next questions, again, pool and spa related. And the question relates to a rental property, and the person says they'll be putting up a relocatable pool in the backyard, and they just want to know what obligations they have in regards to that. So in my presentation last week, I spoke about exemptions in terms of pools, and basically the threshold is if it can hold more than 300 mil of water, then a pool barrier must be installed. But there is a but with that, in that if it is a blow-up pool, it doesn't require a permit and thus doesn't require a barrier. And it does require a permit and a barrier if it's considered to have parts to the pool. And the example I gave last week was some bracing around the pool, as well as a filter attached to the pool. So that's sort of the trigger for it. The information goes on to say, if you intend to keep your relocatable pool erected for 3 consecutive days or longer, you should notify the landlord of this, because the landlord is required to register the pool with council after those 3 days. So again, it comes back to the type of pool being installed. If it's an inflatable blow-up pool, it's considered to be, I guess, a temporary structure. But if it's something a bit more serious with some bracing or a filter, then it is required to go through the process. Ben, here's one for you, and it's a pretty simple one. How do I get a copy of a building permit? So if you could just explain to people the process that they go through to get a copy of a building permit that's been issued, and potentially the plans, which is usually what people are after in this situation.
Yeah, look, it's just a matter of speaking to admin at council. They can generally provide, if you're the owner of the property, they can provide you with the copy of the building permit and any approved plans that were issued in previous years. And there's there's the opportunity to be able to get that without too much hassle from council, because council has to keep all these documents regardless of whether it's building permits been issued by council or it's been issued by a private building surveyor previously. Council's the record keeper for all those types of documents. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, I'll take the next one, and again, it's pool and spa related. It says, what happens if I don't register my pool? So because the registration of pools is a statutory obligation, if you don't register your pool within the required time, you may face an on-the-spot fine or a penalty fine. And this can be up to $1,650. So if the council becomes aware of the pool or spa on your property, they'll send you a written notice requiring you to register that pool or spa. And you'll also be required to pay the registration fee and the information search fee if it's applicable. So that's that one. Ben, the next question again relates around building permits, and it's a doozy for people who work in the building department at council, and it's, what do I need a building permit for?
Yeah, look, basically you need a building permit for most construction these days. The building regulations have a specific schedule that relates to what work can be exempted from a building permit, but you know, there's not a lot that you can exempt these days. It really depends on what you're wanting to do. If you're wanting to build a little garden shed in the backyard that is less than 10 square metres in floor area, is not higher than 2.4 metres in height within, you know, close to a boundary and things like that, and it's in the backyard, that's the sort of thing that you possibly could get an exemption for a building permit. And what I mentioned before, things, certain fences that are under a certain height and those types of things, but there is a requirement for a lot of construction to have building permits these days, yeah.
Yeah, from my experience in council, there's seems to be a misunderstanding within the community that things like decks and pergolas, decks and verandas are exempt. And I know that a lot of people get caught out because of that, and they employ someone to build it, and perhaps they don't ask the right questions, and then they can find themselves on the end of a building notice or a building order from council because the structure doesn't have a permit. But there's a list of exemptions in the legislation, and it's fairly basic. As Ben mentioned, anything that has a structural element to it pretty much requires a permit, unless you have something like the shed that Ben also mentioned, and it meets those requirements. But things like even shop fit outs and things like that, there are other triggers in regards to health and safety of occupants. And so I guess my advice is to go and speak to the building department and run whatever you're proposing past them, to see if it does actually require a permit or not, because you don't want to get caught out and find yourself in that under the pump from council.
Exactly right, Ian. Yeah, it's a matter of reaching out, doing your research, asking questions to us. We're always happy to help answer these questions so that you know for sure that you do or you don't need a permit. Yep, that's right.
Yep. The next one is a query that we've had in it, and it's in regards to indoor spas and do they need to be registered. So the query says it's a spa located in a bathroom, but it's not a spa bath, I guess, where it has a plug and the water escapes. It's described here as a standard spa that you'd normally find in an outdoor area, but it's actually inside. So my understanding is that because it has water in it pretty much all the time, and it doesn't have a plug that you can just remove the water, that it does need to comply with the requirements, the new requirements, I should say, for safety barriers. And another example of this, I guess, but on a larger scale, would be an indoor pool in a hotel or a motel. They're still required to have the necessary fences or barriers around them. So yes, I guess the short answer is that if it's a spa bath, then it doesn't require it. But if it's a spa that has water in it all the time, then it does need to meet the requirements. Another one for you, Ben. I was thinking maybe if you could just give a brief overview of the requirements for protection works notices and the potential for those, and when a building surveyor might ask for someone to serve protection works notices on a neighbour.
Yeah, basically, it's more so when the works that are happening on a particular property are going to somehow affect the adjoining property, and that could mean that the works may have compromise the building that's located next door on the adjoining property. Structurally, if there's earthworks happening on that property, if there's any work that needs to be carried out on the adjoining property to be able to carry out the work on the property in mention. These are the sorts of things that we need to look at, and each project you've got to basically determine whether it will need protection works on their own merits, depending on what work's involved, and it's the building surveyor's discretion there as to what would trigger that. So and there's a process to follow with protection work and forms that are required to be completed by the builder for the work that's happening. And there's also got to be a notice given to the adjoining owner, and they've got to provide a comment back, and these sorts of things as to whether they're, consent to the work being carried out and these types of things. So,
yeah. So it's just basically a protection mechanism for adjoining properties when you're proposing works on your property, and just allows, I guess, the process to be documented so that if there is any damage to the adjoining property during the construction process, that there is, as I said, it has been documented, and there's sort of evidence of it, rather than relying on hearsay or that type of thing. So it is a pretty important part in the building permit process, should it be required, and something that quite often gets overlooked, or perhaps doesn't get it isn't given the importance that it should do in the process.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, Ben, go on.
I was just going to say it's important to, especially where there's been site cuts, where excavation's happening for works on an adjoining property, and you need to be assured that there's not going to undermine footings on another things on another building next door and things like that. That can happen. So that's just another example.
Yep. We've had a couple of queries in regards to who would be conducting the inspections for the new pool and spa safety barrier requirements. And I've got a note here just in regards to, I guess people are sort of jumping the gun a little bit, and they're getting the inspection conducted before their pool gets registered with council, and before they receive the letter stating which copy of the standard the barrier needs to adhere to. And there's a note saying that council's getting a few compliance certificates from owners who don't realise the process and are jumping the gun, which might likely cause them to have their pools inspected again, which then costs them more money because obviously doesn't come for free. So I guess I just wanted to put it out there that if anyone's watching this, please make sure that you get your pool registered first with council and you get the letter, and then you can start the process of finding someone to inspect it. And in terms of who can inspect it, it can be done through council, or it can be done through a private inspector. I made a point last week of just reiterating that people should do their due diligence in regards to the inspection, in regards to the inspector conducting the inspection, just because there are people out there who are saying they're registered, or possibly not saying they're not registered, and conducting the inspections, and basically the inspection isn't worth the paper it's written on if the person isn't registered as a building surveyor or a building inspector. And that again, I'll reiterate what I said last week, that registration can be checked online at the VBA's website. It's a pretty simple portal whereby you punch in the person's name, and it will come up as to whether they're registered or not, and whether their registration is current. So that's an important factor to note. We've also had some queries in regards to the fees. Now, I'm making it a bit of an assumption here, so just cut me a bit of slack if it's not entirely accurate. But the notes I've got here say that the fees for the inspection will be $300 plus GST through council. Now, obviously, if you go through a private person for that, they may choose to charge more or less, but that's what council is charging. And if a re-inspection is required, it will cost $185 plus GST. So that sort of goes back to that point. It gives people an understanding of how much the inspection is going to cost and how much extra it's going to cost if they're getting one before the pool gets registered. And I've also got a note here saying that it will cost approximately $20 to lodge the compliance letter with council once your pool is approved. So that's pretty much all from us. Ben, thank you for your time tonight. Much appreciated.
No, thank you. Thanks, Ian. Thanks everyone that's involved tonight. It's been great.
Yeah, and hopefully there's been some information there that people out there have found useful. And as I said at the end of the last presentation, if you do have further questions, please contact the building department at your local council, or visit the VBA website for additional information. So thank you, and have a good evening. Thanks, Ben.